Class, MASH. By A. Nutty. Chapter 41, Never Ending. One of the creatures was still banging its head on the ground. It was trying to remove the wooden creation that was blinding it. The other creature was charging towards him. MASH knew he needed to change something, and decided the first thing to accomplish was slowing them down. There was too little time between attacks for him to grow out his wood to deal real damage. Changing his tactics, he decided to grow wooden spikes from his armor. He didn't stop growing them even when the creature drew closer. They weren't particularly sturdy and didn't grow long enough to do damage to the creature. He didn't care, letting the creations become more jagged and sharp. When the creature got close, he tried to block its attack with his armor, but it broke through most of the layers of his armor. Though, his armor managed to make small cuts across the thing's neck and face. Many of the spikes broke as he was sent flying, but he was slowly accomplishing his mission. The ground around the creature was littered with sharp remains of his creations, and he quickly started growing his armor again. As expected, it didn't give him enough time to form a proper defense. He tried to parry its next thrust, forming a sword in his hand as he moved. He couldn't stop it completely, the thing's beak managing to tear parts of his armor off. Once the creature's head passed him, he tried to stab into its neck with his weapon but was stopped as he noticed the other's head swinging at him. It hadn't managed to remove the wood, but its swing was still accurate. Thinking it must have another way to see, he jumped backwards, separating from his armor as he did so. He stumbled and turned the motion into a roll, as pain shot up his side from the earlier wound. With his mana territory he could vaguely make out small creatures moving in his side. Needing to deal with them, he grew his wooden armor inwards, piercing his own skin to strike the little creatures. When he felt the movement stop, he fused the wood that was there with his flesh, much like he had with his neck. He didn't think it had worked as well as last time, but the bleeding had been contained, and the parasites were gone. The monsters hadn't waited for him, crashing into him while he dealt with the injury. They sent him tumbling a few times but hadn't managed to get their beaks into his body again. It wasn't like he was running away, rather it was because he was growing his armor continuously and ditching it whenever the creatures attacked. Their synchronization making it easier to stop both attacks with one block. The fight progressed slowly now, his focus shifting to defense. He used his energy to grow his armor out, letting it break apart over the ground. The process repeating for several minutes, though his energy went into more than just the armor, growing out the pieces on the ground whenever he stepped over them. The only conditions for his skills were physical contact, so he grew his armor out to be longer, to scrape against the floor as he moved. All the while, using his energy to make his creations bigger. Despite this, they didn't grow massive and instead layered over the ground in a mess of spikes and thorns. One of the creatures stepped on top of a spike and stumbled. MASH used his connection with the wood to grasp at its feet and claw away its flesh. He used his energy freely, tearing up the creature's feet as he ran towards it. The other monster, which still hadn't removed the covering on his head, charged through a trail of spikes that were now angled towards its feet. Even if they didn't puncture deeply, they managed to slow the creatures down, while at the same time MASH started to speed up. His persist skill kicking in let him charge at the creatures with much more force. His improved stats also let him control the wood more freely, and he piled up many of the shards, forming a spiked shield in his hands. His priority now was to keep his movements continuous, and rather than slamming into the creature directly, he used the shield to push downwards on its head as he jumped over the attack. As he did this, he grew the shield out, cutting deep into the creature's neck, and with his added strength managed to push the shield completely into the ground with his motion. The creature was stuck, its head impaled into the dirt by his shield. Landing, he formed the armor around his hand into a blade, and like an executioner, sliced through its neck and severed its head from the body. The body fell limp as he ran past, but he could still see the snake-like head and neck thrashing about wildly. He finally beat one but didn't stop his movements, parrying the blow of the next monster's attack. It was a thrust that seemed meant to push him away more than hit him, but he countered it while spinning alongside the creature's neck and slicing into it with his still bladed hand. With persist active, he was a lot stronger and faster, able to fight better. His injuries were affecting him less as his fortitude rose, and the creatures were slowing down from the long battle. This fight was morphing into his territory, both because of the wood sprawled along the ground, and since it had become a battle of attrition. Ever since he managed to get persist to work while he fought, he realized that he would be able to beat most things in long fights. Rather than a decisive blow, he struck whenever he could, most of the attacks only managing to inconvenience the monster. He had changed the wood along his arms into mouths, and bit into the creature. Tossing the chunks he ripped off into his mouth, the connection he felt earlier returned, but the bonuses to his stats was making the fight easier. Finally, the opportunity came as the creature slumped onto the ground. He didn't miss it, cutting off the creature's head in a similar motion to the last one. He didn't stop there, instead making his way back to the small creatures from earlier. They started speaking, but he couldn't hear anything as he fell into unconsciousness. Getting up, he quickly gathered his surroundings, a few things surprising him as he woke up. He was surrounded by the little fruit creatures, dozens of them were crawling over him. Slime covered his body as they wiggled around his armor and skin. It was a little disgusting, and he shivered at their motions. He leaped to his feet, sending a few of the creatures scattering across the ground. The motion had revealed what they had done. "I'm sorry. That surprised me." He immediately apologized, realizing that they healed his injuries. Mash checked his condition with his skills, and found that he was almost completely healed, except for the places where he used wood to patch his body together. Those remained, and he could feel the wooden nature of the skin in those places. He might be able to manipulate them, like he did with his creations, but didn't think that would be smart. Returning to his immediate concerns, he was going to ask them about how to find his friends but didn't need to. They spoke in a unified voice before he could ask anything. "Follow parts. Find Ligar and others." He didn't understand what they meant but followed their gazes. He could vaguely make out the dismembered head attempting to move. One of the heads was already gone, and only the one that he had pinned to the ground remained. It was obviously trying to go somewhere. Trying to see where it was headed, he found that he could feel a slight pull in the same direction that it was trying to go. A trail of blood stained the ground in that direction, presumably the other head had already taken the path. "Free and follow. We stay. Dangerous." The creatures confirmed what he already guessed, but he didn't free it just yet. He could probably find his way there with the connection alone. Instead, he needed to relax and meditate a little. Even if his injuries had been dealt with, his energy was still low. Furthermore, he had gained 2 levels from the monsters, each having been enough to earn him a level. When he finished meditating, he allocated his free stats, raising his fortitude more. In these past few fights, he had suffered many hits and injuries, relying on skills to temporarily improve his condition. Raising his fortitude would hopefully make it so that he wouldn't have to rely on temporary stat boosts to survive. Also, he needed to stay alive long enough to even use those buffs. Name, Mash Class, Scale Wood Devourer. Level, 3840. Health, 1000/1000. Energy, 1710/1710. Fortitude, 9100. Endurance, 6971. Strength, 7071. Agility, 7072. Intelligence, 100/100. Wisdom, 65/66. Charisma, 32. Free stats, 10/0, 10 to Fortitude. Skills, Persist, Monowood Creation, Inhuman Hibernation, Mana Territory, Unnatural Energy, Inhumanity, Wooden Body, Carnivorous Tree. He didn't understand where the levels came from. The creatures were still alive and moving, the evidence directly in front of him. If these things were dead, it implied the Ligar had some way to control its dead followers. Did that mean the Ligar was sentient? Considering that it tried to kill him, he didn't think much about doing the same back. Deciding that he didn't want to release the whole creature to the Ligar, he prepared to make a cut further along its neck. As he cut down, separating the creature's head from the rest of its neck, he was surprised when the neck moved independently of the head. It seemed like it was being pulled by a thread, leading into the forest and back towards the mountain. Following behind it, it had taken a straight path, bending around trees and rocks that it collided with. It didn't push through anything, instead avoiding them like the little fruit creatures did. They claimed that it was dangerous, and that they wouldn't follow him, but he caught glimpses of them in the treetops. The trees rustling above him made it hard to hear the other noises of the forest. Though it seemed to be unnecessary. There were no other monsters around despite the increasing densities of mana. It seemed like this path was not tread by the normal monsters. Eventually, the snake-like body entered a small tunnel. It was almost a perfect fit for the creature's body, and he checked to see if he could even follow behind it. He was glad to have followed the creature, even with the faint connection. He doubted that he could find the tunnel on his own. It would have taken him hours or even days to find an entrance like this and hoped that he could fit in this one. It seemed like he could. While the entrance was narrow, he should be able to pull himself through it with a wooden limb. Waving at the creatures who had helped him, he pulled himself down the tunnel, making small insect-like limbs pop out of the edges of his armor. The little legs were able to drag him through the entrance, though it quickly broke into a larger opening, the changing point appearing within his mana territory. Deciding that he needed to follow, he pulled himself closer to the opening. He didn't plan on descending immediately, wanting to scope out the room first. As he got closer, the ground beneath him grew flimsier, and the dirt broke. It slid down into the room and took him with it. He quickly rose to his feet and stared over the room. The room was far larger than he expected, a cave shaped into a semicircular arena. He could easily make out the Ligar. It filled a quarter of the room, with 4 snake-like heads sprouting from an overly large body. It seemed to be observing him back. It had the same golden fur that the previous creatures had but was at least twice as big. Looking over the heads, he realized that 2 of them were the ones he had decapitated. One of the heads was missing the actual head part of the limb, dangling from the creature as an empty neck. Mash stared in wonder, as he noticed flesh regrowing from the cuts, and realized that it was going to regenerate its head. Despite the monster, his focus was elsewhere. There were several entrances to the room, and unsurprisingly, he found himself staring down a group of people in one of them. Leah, Luke, and 2 of the bandits filled the archway. It didn't seem like they had an easy time of it either, torn armor and splotches of blood covering their bodies. They were staring him down, surprise flashing across Leah's face, but Luke just stared dumbly, seemingly lost in thought. He recognized the bandits too, both having been from the earlier fight. One was the shadow user, and the other was the one who fought with Leah. The looks they gave him told him what they were planning. Deciding that he hated the dungeon, he prepared for a fight, growing a sword staff from his hand and thickening his armor. Chapter 42, Chaos. Thankfully, the bandits didn't immediately charge him, the boss having conveniently separated them. He was more surprised to see the boss remain motionless. It seemed to be observing them with an equal measure of curiosity. There was a strange lighting to the room, coming from a bluish-green moss that lined the walls, and making the monster's eyes shine as it stared down at him. Mash felt the connection from earlier and realized it was with the boss. Eating the flesh of the creatures from before must have done something to him, allowing him to feel the connection that they did. You have joined with me. There weren't any words spoken, the message instead found its way into his mind. The sound was vaguely feminine, and he knew where the message had come from. There were no actual words spoken, yet he understood the voice perfectly. Either his inhumanity skill was working better now, or his connection to the creature was something else. The connection had solidified as the Ligar spoke, the gaze of one of its heads locking on him. For his part, he just stood there, unmoving like a statue. Unable to form a response, he didn't even try to communicate with the monster. What would he even say? Glancing back at the bandits, he realized that everyone but Luke vanished, probably becoming invisible. Luke seemed frozen in place, waiting patiently for something to change. At first, Mash thought he would have trouble finding the bandits, but knew he would be able to react to any attacks with his mana territory. Though, that seemed unnecessary as the monster's other heads were tracing the movements of the bandits. Come here, your power is needed. The command strengthened the connection, the creature's posture angling towards him. He almost took a step closer, the words having sounded oddly enchanting. He was able to resist the compulsion and stepped away from the creature as he tried sending back his own response. No. He didn't know if thinking on his own response would be enough, but the creature's agitated movements told him that it got the message. The other head stopped following the bandits, instead locking onto him as well. Maybe, refusing the creature outright hadn't been the best decision in this situation, but he guessed that it was too late now. Before the fight could explode, another entrance had opened, the stone wall breaking away to reveal Red and Jill. Red looked fine, her blood dress still formed around her. Jill's armor was damaged and missing a section along one of her arms, revealing some of the struggles they must have undergone. He tried to call out to them but stopped as a projectile entered his mana territory. He reacted by sidestepping the obvious attack, a knife cloaked in shadows passing beside him. It might have cut him if he couldn't see the full range of the mana within his territory. Even with the shadows obscuring the attack, he could easily make out its size and path. His dodge had been automatic but had left him in a worse situation as a beaked head swung towards him. He could see it entering his territory but was unable to dodge it. The swing was several times faster than the earlier monster, and without any boosts he couldn't keep up with it. The beak slammed into his armor, but he had thickened it well and it only managed to pierce the skin. It was a light wound, and he struck back reflexively. He tried cutting through its neck, but the blade stopped barely a few inches past its scales. He only managed a shallow cut, which started healing as soon as his blade left. He wasn't so lucky, its beak getting caught the bark and throwing him off balance. Losing his footing, he was dragged to the creature's main body, an arrow whizzing by his head as he moved. The Ligar prepared to use Mash like a club and swung at an invisible bandit. He could only barely catch him with his senses, but it was enough, and as the creature swung him around, he grew vicious jagged spikes from his armor. He was trying to pierce the creature and deal more damage to the bandit if he was going to be used this way. It worked like he intended, but not because of anything he had done. The boss had changed its motion, freeing Mash before suffering any of its own injuries. He was sent flying at the bandit, further than the swing would have been. The bandit stepped backwards, prepared to dodge a swing, but the throw had managed to hit him. Despite the bandit's greater stats, he wasn't able to react again, and spikes punched holes in his body, as they both slammed into the wall. The blow hadn't left Mash undamaged though, and he stumbled from the wall seeing double. His brain had been shaken by the attack, and his reactions were coming more slowly. He barely reacted as someone entered his vision, almost attacking instinctively but managed to stop as recognition dawned. Jill quickly grabbed hold of Mash, teleporting him out of the way of several incoming attacks. She brought him to Red, who quickly broke something in her hand, a bubble growing around their group. Reacting quickly, faster than she would have before, she started healing Mash. Even if it wasn't as strong as Luke's, it managed to close some of his wounds. He gave them a quick rundown of their situation. Within the temporary shield, he sat and started to meditate. He only managed it for a few seconds, but it cleared his mind like he hoped it would. The shield only blocked 2 of the boss's swings, breaking in a flash of light. The distraction let Jill teleport them to a better position. It wasn't a huge change in distance, but they had managed to avoid the boss's attacks while being able to face down the remaining bandits and Luke. Luke was charging at them, growing larger as he moved. His buffs shone faintly, but his movements were awkward. Red looked at the bandits before dashing towards Luke. "I can handle him." That left Jill and Mash to face off against the boss and the 2 bandits, and he was pleased to see Leah having to dodge an attack from the boss. The boss obviously had a particular vendetta against Mash but was still attacking the others when it had the opportunity. Jill seemed eager to fight against the bandit who had cut her throat earlier and faced off against that one. She had some skill to spot the bandit and moved to intercept him. Mash stared down Leah, even if he wasn't finding her with his eyes. This is the fight he wanted. Growing out additional limbs across his back, several of which ended in dragon-like mouths, he charged at Leah. From their earlier fights, he gained a basic understanding of her skills and fighting styles and was unsurprised as she tried to slash at his neck again. He easily caught the blade with his own and struck at her with one of his additional limbs. It wasn't a mouth, he was still reluctant about eating other humans, even if it was through one of his creations. Instead, he tried to slash her with a limb that ended in a blade, though as it passed through her body, it got stopped by a thin barrier of light. She hadn't revealed this skill earlier and it caught him off guard, but not as much as she hoped. She followed up with a slash across his abdomen with her other hand, but his focus didn't waver, the wood growing thicker to block the slash. Her blade bounced off his armor, and they were both forced to dodge the boss's next attack. It hadn't been aiming at them in particular, all but one of the boss's heads was thrashing about wildly. Its final head was glowing vaguely blue along its neck, and he realized what was coming. He couldn't alert the others without informing the bandits, but it seemed irrelevant as everyone turned to face the increased density of mana. It increased several times beyond what he felt in the air, the boss's very body seeming to become a conduit for mana. In under a second, the whole room flashed with a bright white light. The ground shaking from the sound of rumbling that chased the attack, and waves of energy shooting out in all directions from where the boss's attack. It hadn't aimed at any of them, simply striking the ground in front of it. The mana branched out from the point, hitting everyone in the room. Mash had been closest to the origin, and a fork of white light pierced through his side. He only realized it hit him when he felt pain spring up from his side. There was a small delay, from when he felt the pain to when he was sent flying in an explosion of force and heat. He slid across the floor, his armor torn apart where the attack had pierced him. Thankfully, the strike had been where his wooden skin was, and he was able to begin repairing even as he pushed himself to his feet. It took a lot of effort to stand, and he guessed that some of his organs were damaged. Looking towards everyone else, he was glad to see his friends stirring. Jill was somehow unscathed, and he didn't know how she managed that. The bigger issue was Red, her dress having completely lost its form. It must not have been able to block the lightning well, but it was still moving, meaning that she was probably healing herself. Smoke was rising from Luke's body as he slumped over onto the ground. He was twitching slightly, but his buffs were still shining. He would be able to heal, so Mash refocused on the bandits. The bandits hadn't fared any better than them, and he knew that they wouldn't have the same healing capabilities. It was hard to tell what injuries the shadowy bandit had obtained, but his movements had slowed dramatically, and Mash thought that he was limping slightly. Since Jill had managed to avoid the attack somehow, she was at a huge advantage in her fight now. Leah had taken serious damage like he had, and he noticed that she had a deep black scar running across her abdomen. Her armor shredded in a cracked line along her chest, the skin underneath burnt. She was obviously in more pain than him, unable to do anything for the injuries. He was glad to have already mixed the portion of his body where the attack had landed with wood and considered doing it to the rest of his body. The change protecting him from suffering a more serious injury. His inhumanity skill sent him a warning at the thought, and he realized that it was too dangerous to do something like that. Despite the control of wood that he had, he knew that the portions of his body that had been altered by his wood, functioned more poorly now. Honestly, he might want to consider getting them replaced by a high-level healer. Leah grinned at him, a nasty look of overconfidence covering her face. She must believe that his injuries were worse, and looking down at himself, he realized that his wooden carapace was covered in black cracks originating from the wound on his side. Seeing the opportunity, he played up his injuries, limping towards her awkwardly while growing new limbs over his back. He only grew 2 limbs now, trying to make them as big as his full-grown wings. One ending in a spiked shield, the other in a dragon's maw. He was burning through energy, trying to manipulate and grow his creation. Though, his energy reserves were larger now, and he could hopefully control the bigger wings. She started moving towards him, faster than he expected, considering her condition. Deciding to end this fight now, he focused on attacking now while he still had the advantage. The spell had done its damage, and he needed to finish the fight. She closed the distance with confidence, stabbing at his chest with her dagger. Rather than blocking it, he let the dagger enter his armor, confident that it wouldn't reach his heart. Instead, he tried smashing her with the spiked shield on her back, while using his hand to hold her in place. He grabbed the arm with the dagger in both of his hands but left himself vulnerable to the attack from behind. He saw the boss's attack enter his mana territory and hoped that he could withstand it. He brought the shield down on Leah, but she used her other hand to form a small shield of light, blocking the spikes from entering her head. Another skill he didn't know about, though it was too small to block his entire attack. Spikes pierced her body along her arms and shoulders. The arm he was holding was torn off, and she took a deep wound, a wooden spike partially separating her shoulder from the rest of her body. She screamed in pain, but he couldn't enjoy his victory, the Ligar's mouth having opened wide enough to eat him. It had grown significantly larger and managed to chomp through his wooden creations, easily separating him from his additional limbs. He couldn't even see if he managed to kill Leah, as he was swallowed by the boss. Chapter 43, Mines. Jill P.O.V. Jill watched as the lightning struck the floor. It exploded into branches of power that spread towards everything in the room. She had picked up an item that would give her an extra second to react to any life-threatening attacks. She didn't really understand how foresight magic worked but didn't care, teleporting upwards to avoid the lightning beneath her. Looking down at the field, she saw beams of light hit everyone else. Her screams weren't fast enough to give anyone a real warning. Red had taken the most damage since her back was turned. The lightning slammed into the center of her back, and she collapsed on the ground. Jill thought she was dead, but her armor of blood started swirling around her, pulsing, and beating like a heart. Luke had been restrained by strands of Red's blood and couldn't put up any defense against the lightning. His bigger size caused him to take more hits, his skin now crisscrossed in charred black lines. He was still struggling against those restraints, and she knew that he would be okay. Leah and Mash both took hits, but both were still moving after the attack. Mash surviving that with his armor made some sense, but how did Leah? Jill might need to go help Mash and landed facing the bandit who she was fighting. It was the scumbag who slit her throat earlier, and she was pleasantly surprised to see him limping. She couldn't see his injuries with the shadows cloaking his body but knew that they were bad. He had tried to go invisible, but she was prepared, using her spatial sense skill to follow his movements. The skill did a lot since it was an improvement on her enhanced senses from before. On top of boosting her physical senses, it granted her a new one. She guessed it was how the Fae saw the world. At first it had been jarring, but by now she realized what it had done. It let her see the truth of whatever she looked at. She only wished it was up all the time like Mash's mana territory and expected it might happen at her next advancement. She needed to conserve her mana for her spatial spells. She dodged a thrown dagger easily and used her spatial magic to try and rip his arm off. Before he would have been able to avoid it completely, but he was a lot slower now, the lightning having fried his systems. His arm got caught by her spell, it was just above his wrist, and she watched as his forearm exploded. If her spell could deal that much damage, then he was much weaker now. She found herself grinning sadistically as she approached him. She didn't think twice, and teleported directly behind him, using her poisoned dagger to slit his throat. It felt strangely right, as she ran her blade across his neck. A surge of satisfaction filled her head as the man fell clutching his throat. She watched as he died, and only then realized that she was smiling. The satisfaction was quickly replaced with disgust. She had killed a person, and she should not be feeling happy about it. Even if he was a bandit, even if he deserved to die, she would not let herself feel joy for being the one to do it. Honestly, she didn't even know where the feeling came from. Having never killed a person before, she didn't know what to think. Perhaps Mash would know. There was no real justice in this. She fought him and killed him for revenge. She felt tears running down her cheeks. Her cheeks must have been red since she was filling with anger. It wasn't directed at the bandits or even herself, but at this whole shitty situation. Instead of losing herself in those thoughts, she looked over the battlefield, desperate to find something to divert her attention. It wasn't hard to find. Mash and Leah's fight was coming to an end and Red had managed to start moving and block one of the boss's heads. Luke was still down, and she could go to restrain him. Red claimed that he was being controlled or manipulated by Leah, and Jill hoped that he would be okay. Deciding to help Mash finish his fight with Leah first, she started to head towards them. Honestly, Mash somehow looked more monstrous now. She didn't know what happened, but his other eye was different too. It was black with white concentric circles, each of the white lines glowing faintly. There was also a new patch of scales around his neck. Running towards him, she saw Leah rush at him, and the boss move behind him. Arriving too late, she was only able to observe as the fight ended. She used up her mana teleporting everyone earlier and couldn't close the distance. Mash slammed his weapon down, tearing Leah apart with a spiked weapon, but Leah had stabbed him with a dagger. Then she saw the boss's head grow as it surged behind Mash. She tried to yell, to warn Mash, but he couldn't hear her, and she could do nothing to help him. She watched as he was swallowed by the monster. Mash p.o.v. Mash didn't know what to expect from being eaten by the creature. Honestly, he didn't realize it could alter the size of its body and hadn't worried about being swallowed whole. He should have expected the boss to have more abilities after it shot lightning at them. He didn't immediately panic, knowing that this would only make his attacks more effective. When he had seen the overly large creatures before, he contemplated how he would even go about harming them. Entering their bodies seemed like the only effective methods to him. Now that he was inside, he started his plan. He started funneling his energy towards his armor, trying to grow it as violently as possible. He didn't care much for the shape and was simply trying to morph into an abomination. He would pop this thing's neck like a bubble. Though it didn't work, his energy seemed to dissipate as soon as he tried to use it. The creature seemed to have some way of stopping magic within its own body. Of course, he already had a skill that did something similar and would be surprised to hear that the monsters didn't have a better version. That's when the panic started. Struggling to come up with a viable strategy, he tried to feel for what the creature was doing to absorb his energy. He couldn't feel it exactly, but it seemed like his body was slowly dissolving into the flesh of the creature. His energy was acting as a barrier that the creature was trying to punch through. He didn't know if it would ever get through with his persist skill, but since he wasn't able to move, he might just pass out as soon as it activated. No, he couldn't wait for that, he needed to start replenishing his energy now. Meditation might work, but it would never give him the capacity to break free and only supply the monster with more energy. A thought came to him, and he bit into the inside flesh of the creature, tearing off a chunk and swallowing it. He tried not to think about what he was doing or eating, instead focusing on the feeling of his energy being drained away. It didn't work. The creature's raw bloodied flesh tasted oddly sweet, and its blood made his mouth and throat tingle as it went down. It reminded him of alcohol but had a strong metallic taste. Every bite he took strengthened his connection to the creature, its thoughts coming more naturally into his mind. The connection went both ways though, and it was receiving his own thoughts in return. Accept your fate. You are merely another part of me. The voice was enchanting, but he also felt a sense of desperation from the creature. Whatever was happening outside was certainly inconveniencing it, and it was still trying to deal with him. He willed his own thoughts to disrupt it, to give those outside a better chance. No. I will kill you. He yelled the words aloud, even if he didn't need to. Each word firming his own resolve, he continued to eat through the creature. As he was devouring his next bite, he realized that his stats had improved significantly, making the process even easier. He tried to move his arms to tear apart the creature, but his stats were still not high enough for that. Energy falling dangerously low, he started using his inhuman hibernation skill. With his boosted stats, he hoped that it would improve the skill's efficiency, letting him heal and recover energy faster than the creature could drain it. Stop resisting. It is futile, your fate is inevitable. Feeling his energy return faster than the creature could steal it, filled him with confidence. He responded to the creature thinking about his events with the world carrier and trying to send the image to it like he had done with the behemoth. The images were followed by words, each defining his superiority despite the situation. Even fate cannot control my future. I won't let you do it. He was in the creature's body, in the process of being eaten, but he knew that he would win. His stats were rising, energy recovering, and wounds healing. Eventually he would win, and the creature would die. His eyes snapped open as he felt the creature's attempts to drain him end. It was a pointless gesture, it was far too dark for him to see anything, and he had been relying on his mana territory for a while. All it did was get some blood in his eyes, causing him to shut them again, tears building behind closed eyelids. Thinking about it, he didn't know how long he had been inside the creature. The drastic improvements to his stats meant that the fight was dragging on. He knew that his buffs would start to wear off in about an hour, so it must not have been that long. He wondered why the creature had stopped draining him, perhaps Red or Jill managed to kill it. He could still feel the connection though and noticed that the creature seemed to be whimpering. It spoke, a surprising amount of fear coming through the connection, and he could feel the creature's body rumble as it let out a low hiss. You have been marked. I had not known, I will of course follow one of the chosen. He couldn't even begin to process what was happening, and the monster's statements only created new questions. He guessed that being marked was special but didn't believe that he was the only person to receive one. What did it mean to be chosen? How many other chosen were there? Why him? As he thought of the questions, he tried to send them to the monster, hoping for any response. Having become surprisingly subservient, it replied to his question. It means, the owner of this world is interested in you. I do not know why. Its voice trailed off, and he could feel that the creature was thinking about something. Mash didn't bother paying any more attention to its thoughts. He started meditating again, perhaps with its guard down, he could break through the creature now. He just needed to recover his energy. Starting the meditations, he noticed the creature begin to do something on its own. He didn't understand what, until it spoke. Its voice sounded serene again, and the connection seemed to set itself between them. I will help you recover. I will grant us power. We will be free. Mash felt the creature's words become more solid within his mind and accepted them. Becoming free was his utmost priority, and if the creature was willing to grant him power, he would not refuse. Thinking on the strange wording, he wondered what it meant by we. He felt it, it was like the rush of leveling, but felt more physical than that experience. The creature was giving him its mana. Within his mana territory he could see the creature shrinking on the outside, its wolfish body cast aside, the four heads merging and shrinking towards him. Seeing it now, he realized that the snake-like portions of the creatures were the real bodies. They were controlling the beast bodies somehow, and he could feel their mana spreading through those bodies like parasites. There was plenty of its mana inside himself, and it kept growing. Eventually everything cleared away, and he found himself lying on the ground. His armor was dissolved in places, but all the skin on his body was unharmed. The creature must have healed him when it gave him its mana. He could feel it still swirling inside his body. It was distinctly separate from his energy, moving around his body like parasites. He looked over his surroundings, and saw Red and Jill staring him down, weapons poised to strike, uncertain glances passing between the two of them. Chapter 44, Unusual Circumstances. Mash was happy to see them, and relieved to notice that the fight was over. He looked over the surroundings, noticing Leah's dead body slumped over to one side of the room. It seemed like he had managed it before getting eaten. He didn't feel any satisfaction for getting his revenge. He felt nothing for his kill, an emptiness filling him like it had before. Except this time, he was able to notice how unnatural the feeling was. It was as if all his emotions just stopped, hitting a barrier and dissipating. He surmised the cause was his class. From what the world carrier had told him, the classes were influencing his mind and body. He wondered if everyone felt the same way, or if different classes caused different feelings. His sister had certainly disliked the concept of death, but his father and brother seemed somewhat apathetic. Plus, she never killed anyone as far as he knew. Did combat classes change a person's mind? If that was the case, what about his runner class? Did that count? He needed to ask someone about them, and looked towards Jill and Red. Jill at least, must have killed the shadow bandit. His question died as he met their faces. They did not seem happy, still sending glances between them. Eventually, they came to some unspoken decision and moving closer, Jill asked him a few questions. What happened to the boss? Did you kill it? Her. The boss was female. Mash's response came automatically, as if it were something else that was speaking. Red and Jill were looking at him strangely now, eyes narrowing with suspicious gazes. He didn't know what to say either. Where had the information even come from? He got an answer, but it wasn't out loud, instead he heard the response within his head. We are one now. My knowledge is now yours. Leaping to his feet, Mash looked around, unsure of what exactly was happening. He could feel his heart rate rising, still unable to see the boss, he tried to feel the mana within his own body. There he found the boss's mana, which outlined 3 snake-like creatures moving around within him. What's wrong? Red's voice came out quickly, her eyes flicking around the room, trying to see what he was looking at. Mash wanted to know the answer too and thought of the question, trying to send it to the boss like he did before. The response came again, and he got the feel of exasperation from the being, annoyance coming through the bond. You have agreed to the connection, and now your mind controls and guides mine. While my mind controls the rest of our bodies. I can even control your body if you will it. No. That's okay, and did you really expect me to know? Mash responded quickly, not wanting to give it the possibility. He didn't want to let the creature control his body, the thought causing him to shiver slightly. He asked the question, confused as to why he would be expected to know. He had read of monster tamers but didn't think that their situation was similar. The connection was simply too different from what he had read. The creature's next response confirmed his suspicions. Our connection isn't as flimsy as one of the tamer bonds. It is more permanent, more powerful. You lack so much information. That apparent lack bothered the creature, a flood of information and images entered his mind. He didn't seem like he could resist or stop the creature, but neither did it feel like it was doing anything to harm him. The information though, was a little much for him, and he could feel a headache building. It didn't last long with only a couple heartbeats passing, but the information he gained was surprising. The creature's knowledge was skewed, and he got everything from her perspective. He understood what their connection was. It was as she said. His mind was in charge, but not alone. They were linked, but she still maintained an independence, having a mind of her own. He still guided them though, and she would have to follow his commands. On the other hand, she was able to control all the bodies that she produced. There were only 3 bodies right now, but he could already feel her creating more. She was siphoning a small amount of energy and regrowing additional bodies. Each additional body strengthened the both of them. It improved his natural regeneration, resistances, and even some of his stats. There was one other benefit that seemed useful, its mind would add to his own, improving things like concentration and processing power, even if it didn't directly change his stats. Speaking of stats, he took the opportunity to look at what the improvements were like. Name, Mash class, Scale Wood Devourer. Level, 40. Health, 1070/1070. Energy, 1750/1750. Fortitude, 100/107. Endurance, 71/75. Strength, 71/77. Agility, 72/76. Intelligence, 100. Wisdom, 66. Charisma, 32. Free stats, 0. Skills, Persist, mono-wood creation, inhuman hibernation, mono-territory, unnatural energy, inhumanity, wooden body, carnivorous tree. He found himself grinning. This would hopefully be enough to compensate for his lack of years of training. Although there were certainly others who had ways to boost their stats and would still be a little ahead of him. He would take what he could get, and the other abilities that the boss could offer were also useful. She didn't have enough power now, but eventually she would be able to shoot lightning she did before. On top of that, she could change her body's size once she was outside. Currently she could become as big as a large dog. Honestly, everything but the body control was useful, and he was happy to have her. Good, now you are beginning to see. Except not fully. That last comment came off very snidely, and he realized that his mind was probably affecting hers too. He was going to ask the boss but realized that he had left his friends hanging. They did not look pleased, and by now Luke was coming to his senses. Well, are you finally done with spacing out? Care to explain anything, like at all? He was in fact, done with spacing out and explained his situation. He even tried to get the boss to come out. She did as he asked, and peeled out from his neck, forming into her snake-like body. The curved beak at the front, giving away her identity. There was one difference now, her scales had changed colors, matching his own black scales. There was another noticeable issue. When she left his body, he felt his stats drop a little, and predicted his stats would drop back to normal when all her bodies were outside. I guess, I control the boss now. Gives me some boosts. He raised his hand up, and the boss moved to his palm. She was able to stick to his body easily and crawled along his skin and armor. He expected himself to react to the movement, for it to feel uncomfortable. Instead she felt like an extension of his own body. Her scales sliding across his skin felt the same as his own hands would. It has the same eyes as you. Red sounded very interested, and had moved closer to look at the boss. It seemed like her curiosity was getting the better of her caution. Although, he noticed Jill was resting her hand on the pommel of her dagger. After hearing Red, he looked over the boss more carefully. The eyes did not match what he expected. One of its eyes was like his monster one, a thin, white triangular pupil surrounded by black nothingness. The other was a replica of the world carriers, with a white circular pupil, surrounded by concentric rings of white while everything else was filled with darkness. Both shone faintly, almost invisibly. Only upon close examination did he notice the glow. The vision. Red yelled the words, her face filling with noticeable surprise. She quickly looked towards Jill, who nodded her head. Mash forgot that the string of fate had given his friends a vision, only now realizing that it might have been of his own future. He remembered something else, and quickly gave them his reply. The vision is probably false now. The snake from earlier can't control my future anymore. He didn't stop there, explaining the events since they parted ways. Clearly, they were still very uncertain but decided to trust him anyways. There was another distraction as well, who was struggling to get to his feet. Luke, finally coming to his senses, looked over the three of them. The most concerning thing to Mash were the tears filling Luke's eyes. His face contorted in despair. I'm sorry. I see couldn't he do anything. His words were strained, his disappointment was obvious. Shaking with each word and stuttering slightly, he continued to explain his situation. Leah had some kind of charm skill. She told me it only worked on beastmen. Even now, I feel like I need to save her, or do something for her. Mash realized that he wasn't shaking with sadness but shivering in disgust. The effects of that kind of skill were repulsive. It was the kind of skill that got outlawed. Luke had a lot of other information to give, explaining who Leah was and what she was doing. She was with the bandits and had snuck into the city to find the others. Apparently, they were stuck at the top of the dungeon, having suffered some injuries from escaping the guards. They couldn't find the way through either. Once they found the way through, she enacted her plans. Luke knew what she would do, but couldn't do anything to stop them. He tried resisting, but she ultimately strengthened her control, causing him to become a mindless puppet. He also had some information on the bandits' plans in general. They were connected to rebels within the Beastmen city. Led by Beastmen, they wanted to become independent from the kingdom, to abandon the human king. The banditry was in preparation for a war, but not an invasion. Meant to cut off support from the neighboring cities, while they started a civil war inside. Luke didn't get any specific names. Although, Mash thought Davin would appreciate the information. Hopefully, he wasn't the one running the bandits. Mash guessed that it might be Ellis, since Leah really might have been her sister. Luke didn't know either. Hoping he didn't really kill Ellis's sister, Mash asked Red and Jill for what happened to them. They had some new items, and he was curious to hear about what they experienced. However, he never got the opportunity, Luke speaking up more quickly than he could. Who are you? You're not Mash. Your soul is different. Luke took a step backwards, raising his hands for a fight. Although, he clearly wasn't ready for another fight, both mentally and physically exhausted. So, for the second time, Mash explained what had happened. Jill and Red seemed interested, despite having heard the story already. It's not every day that you meet someone of unfathomable power. Thinking about it, he realized that it was a surprisingly common occurrence for him. My power is also unfathomable to you. Finding the need to interject, the boss added in her own input. It seemed like his thoughts would no longer be his alone. Well, the boss was a part of him now, so he guessed that wasn't entirely true. The boss hadn't melded back into him, now sitting on his shoulder, with her tail wrapped around his neck. He wasn't sure if he liked the snide remarks, but it did make him more comfortable with the creature. Thinking about it, he asked the creature for her name. She didn't have one, not ever having a need for an identifier. Is there a name you have in mind? I can't keep calling you the monster or the boss, it doesn't feel right. He asked the question aloud, so the others wouldn't think he was weird for having another mental conversation. Calling it those things really did feel wrong. The boss was a part of him now, and he wouldn't refer to himself that way. When the boss made it apparent that she didn't have anything in mind, everyone tried coming up with names for her. He did as well, offering her a few but ultimately leaving the choice to her. The discussion grew longer, and they found themselves talking freely. The tension they felt was slowly dissolving as the names grew sillier. Chapter 45, Benefits. They were done with the dungeon and wanted to leave. Hopefully, they would never need to come back. Despite his connection with the world carrier, Mash agreed with their sentiment. This experience had not been pleasant, with most things going wrong. They did get stronger, but any dungeon run would do that. He gained a lot of information but had made too many decisions in haste. Being forced to make decisions in awkward situations was an accurate summation of this dungeon. Did you ask anyone for more time? He heard Priscilla's voice within his head. Priscilla had been the name the boss chose, enjoying the more human-like nature of it. He didn't know what to think about her preferring a human name, but at least he found no problem pronouncing it. The message she sent indicating her apparent dislike with his thought process. She was adding her own remarks frequently to his thoughts, and he started incorporating them more naturally to his internal dialogues. Adjusting to her presence was surprisingly easy, it felt like recovering a lost limb. This was a remark he chose to ignore, instead continuing to follow the others through the dungeon. They didn't really clear the dungeon, the boss was still alive. He asked her about the rewards and learned that they were a product of the class system. Whomever created the class system designed it to reward them for killing powerful beings inside of dungeons. His knowledge that dungeons were other worlds created some problematic implications with that. He considered the other beings within the world. How many people would have massacred the intelligent species for the chance at some reward? If he had met the creatures in a different order, he probably would have killed them. They had looted the bandits earlier, finding several of the items that the Adventurers Guild had listed as missing. It would prove their accomplishments and validate the information that they had. They decided to inform the guild of the bandits' plans, and leave it to them to decide what information to divulge. The political implications of the events were beyond them, and they didn't want to get involved too deeply. The bigger problem was the situation with Leah. They still didn't know if she was really related to Ellis, but she certainly looked like she was. Not wanting to make enemies with Ellis had been the plan, though it didn't seem like it would work. They could try and find Davin and speak to him alone, but they didn't know how easy that would be. Also, it was unlikely that he would trust them. They didn't have the influence in the city for their words to be taken seriously. No, their best bet was to leave the information at the guild and get out of town. There was another city further east, and they could rest safely there. Going back home would take a few days, so it would be easier to continue to head east. The city was a lot smaller, but it was safe, and they wouldn't have to worry about running into Ellis. They wanted to take a break, having to watch their backs wouldn't let them rest. They would be able to make it there in a few hours and wanted to get out of the dungeon quickly. Mash paid a lot of attention to his surroundings as they left since he hadn't been able to see it on his way down. Knowing that dungeons were part of other worlds, how did they constantly have a new source of monsters? What about the labyrinth from earlier? The portals connect to different places every so often, this portal would eventually lead to another location as well. Labyrinths are unique as far as I know. Priscilla's answer was welcome, and he thanked her internally. Claiming that it was like thanking himself, she did not like the gesture, and he could feel a little irritation from the bond. He was grateful anyways, the information having proven very useful thus far. I think you mean as far as we know. It was a small change, mainly to make a jab at her phrasing. She usually never used an identifier like I. It seeming to go against her beliefs. Not meaning to be hurtful, he felt bad as regret bled through the bond. She was sending him a series of regretful apologies, and he felt worse since she took it so seriously. Letting her know that things were fine, he tried moving their thoughts to the surroundings, analyzing what he could from the inside of the cavern. From the inside of the mountain, he could see the rock was whiter than he expected. They had been walking for a while, but the stone's color had been constant for the entire trip. He wondered what the stone was. Speaking aloud to the others, Red and Jill turned around to look at him. Luke was dragging behind, still not feeling comfortable. Do you guys know why the stone is so white? Never really noticed, you know, with the whole murderous bandits chasing us. Jill's response was dry, exhaustion lingering at the edges of her voice. The others didn't have an answer, Luke seeming to not be paying much attention to the conversation. The answer did come to Mash, Priscilla sending him a series of images and thoughts. She didn't respond verbally, and he could already see some uses for this ability. She could change her size and could act as a scout, passing him images as she saw them. In fact, she could send him images from each of her bodies. He could feel her smugness as he realized how much more she could accomplish. He didn't respond to her though, instead choosing to enlighten his friends on the information. It's a tooth. Some monster was trying to kill the thing that I told you guys about. He sounded certain, able to see a clear image of the monster from Priscilla's vision. It didn't look particularly intimidating from the mental image, but the sheer size of the creature had horrified Priscilla. It was like an enormous fish, though its mouth was lined with millions of sharp teeth. When it tried to take a bite out of the world, it destroyed everything, turning the world into a planet of rubble. Everything on the surface was ground beneath the churning mass of teeth. Priscilla only managing to survive because of her specific nature. Most of the creatures that remained alive were like her. A singular mind that manipulated many bodies, even the bad creatures they first encountered were like that. It was this vision that showed him just what kind of experiences Priscilla must have had. On top of that, it meant that she has been around since the creation of the dungeon. How many adventurers had she killed? Even though he didn't really want the answer, he was amazed at the hundreds of images of people that passed through his mind. She didn't stop with just those images, revealing times where she lost the fight, and was forced to recover slowly through one of her other bodies. Apparently, it was near impossible to kill her, and eventually she would be able to do the same for him. Honestly, the idea of transferring his mind, consciousness, or whatever, was a little scary. He told the others of the creature, and how the tooth ended up here. They were obviously surprised, and a little jealous that he could see the image. It was understandable, he had gained a lot from this dungeon, the biggest reward having been Priscilla herself. Jill and Red managed to find a few items, some of which were valuable, but they paled in comparison to his rewards. The best thing that they found was a ring for Jill. It would give her a small amount of foresight to otherwise fatal attacks. It had saved her life against Priscilla's lightning. Their levels had changed as well, with him able to get the most benefits by fighting alone. He was 2 levels above the two of them, and 3 above Luke. He really benefited from the dungeon but still desperately wanted to leave. If they accept one of my bodies, I could communicate with them as well. Mash considered asking them but stopped as the rest of the process entered his mind. She was suggesting making them into something like herself. She didn't see the problem with it, considering his mark as a sign of privilege. That his friends would be happy to accept the position. It was natural to her because it was part of her nature, but he knew how wrong it would be to do that to another human. Just the fact that he could do that was horrifying. It would probably be banned and maybe even get him killed, if others found out. Plus, that would mean that all their minds would be linked like his was with hers. He didn't want to relinquish his privacy more than he already had. You would lose nothing. We are fundamentally the same being now. He ignored the comment, they came whenever he treated her like a separate creature instead of another part of himself. Although, he didn't see that changing, since she was a female, and he was male. He got a message about how gender didn't matter for a situation like theirs, and while he couldn't fully disagree, it still felt strange. The subject had been so distracting that he almost missed the shift in mana around a nearby wall. Stop! There is something on that wall. He yelled the first word, thinking it was a trap, but was quickly informed by his mana territory that it was an illusion. It was a hidden passage of some kind, and he waved his hand through the wall to dispel the illusion. Priscilla, why is there an invisible wall here? He asked the question aloud, that way his friends would know to wait for him to get an answer. It took her a minute of thinking and analyzing the illusion before giving her response. I don't know. That was all she sent him. The incompleteness of the answer irritated him. Sensing his irritation, she elaborated before he could pry for more. I mean, it was not made by me, nor is it natural. I expect it was made by one of your kind, or another who treats these worlds as places of conquest. The more complete answer made him pause. Before asking anything else, he asked her for images of other species that acted like he did. The images he received this time were a lot more diverse than he expected. There was a plethora of intelligent species with access to magic and weapons. Several of the images depicting other humanoid creatures, though they had some stark differences. There was one of something like a human, but instead of normal skin they were covered in colorful stone. It was carved into the skin, resembling the chitinous exterior of insects. They were typically dark shades of brown and black but were covered in cracks of bright vibrant colors. They wore clothing that seemed advanced even to him, each covered in highly detailed embroidery. He couldn't contain the information, telling his friends excitedly about the many species passing through his mind. His excitement and interest leaked into Priscilla's mind, and she continued sending him more images from her memory. He barely noticed when his friends asked him if it was safe to enter the pathway. They were not as excited as he was. Being unable to see the images with the same clarity, his descriptions, while interesting, couldn't grasp the detail. He was no bard and didn't know how to articulate himself better. He indicated that it should be mostly safe, but to be careful. Unable to sense anything dangerous, they entered. The path winded downwards for a little bit, then it opened into a small room. It was filled with skeletons, a group of 7 humanoid corpses lining the walls. The people must have hidden here in the past and died slowly, unable to escape from the dungeon. If they made it down here, he wondered why they hadn't been able to leave. Perhaps, the exit to the dungeon had shifted, and they were trapped between unknown worlds. It would be a good idea to find out if they could tell when a dungeon's gate would change. He didn't want to be trapped jumping between other worlds. Well, maybe that would be interesting once he was extremely powerful. The others were more excited with the other things in the room, a stash of items piled up in the center. It seems like there would be a big reward for the dungeon after all. Chapter 46, Expectedly Unexpected. The mountain of items was interesting, but after a quick glance, he could tell that the majority of the items were worthless. They might have been valuable once, but they decayed over the passage of time. Now, most of them wouldn't function and could even be harmful to use. He had a thought, and summoned Priscilla, speaking aloud for the benefit of his friends. Can you use my mana sense to determine what items are still useful? He had thought about this earlier too. She had some connection to his own senses and figured that she would be able to benefit from his mana territory. Plus, she would have her own knowledge to add to the search. Her memory so far has been perfect, and he guessed that she would know what some of the items did. He was more interested in inspecting the bodies. Initially, they looked human, but he noticed some subtle differences among the skeletons. At first, he assumed they were just people with changes from their class, but they all had the same differences. Realizing that they were a different species, he inspected the bodies more carefully. The most unique feature were the arms and hands of the skeletons. There was an extra joint along the arm, a second elbow from which to bend it. 8 long fingers sat on each of their hands, each finger an equal length. Opening and closing his own hands, he wondered if that was an improvement or not. You can just try it. He was surprised to hear Priscilla's voice, glancing to check on the pile of items. Mash had come to the same conclusion and didn't need her to point it out. He grew additional fingers on his hand, extending his own figures in an emulation of the skeleton. At first it felt awkward, but after flexing his hand a few times, he adjusted to the changes. It didn't seem to be much better, if anything it made it a little harder to grip some things. Trying to imagine what a hand like this could be used for, he only thought of one possibility. The extra fingers could make playing music a lot easier. A few instruments already seemed designed for people with them. The other noticeable difference was their skulls. On top of being wider than a typical person, he noticed 2 rows of teeth on the top of their mouths, and their mouths seemed like they could be opened more fully. Their clothes were interesting too. Not particularly fancy, they seemed designed to work around any abnormal growths or injuries. They were essentially wide strips of cloth, that draped over themselves, tying it in certain places to hold it together. There were plenty of gaps and their arms were completely exposed. Honestly, he thought it was a design that was well suited for combat and considered taking some. Realizing the implications immediately, he quickly moved to inspect the items with the others. He didn't want to rob the dead of their clothes, he could just have it custom-made later. As expected, most of the items were useless, but Priscilla had managed to find 5 that still seemed to function. Looking over all of the items, he quickly realized that there were no weapons present. At least nothing that looked like a weapon, though a few of the objects were completely unknown to him. Priscilla recognized a fair bit, sending him images of these people fighting her. She had more bodies at the time, and the group was defeated easily. Thinking about it, he realized that he was bonded with the creature that had led to these people's deaths, and now he was going to take their items. Even he knew how evil that was, guessing that the people would curse him for it if they were still alive. Well, it didn't matter, they were dead and that wouldn't change. Also, these items were too valuable to let rot in this small cave. Asking Priscilla about the first item, he received an image of it in use. Priscilla pushed the item towards Jill, already knowing Mash's thoughts. He shared the function of it with the group, while learning about the specifics himself. Priscilla was able to analyze the mana. The combination of her own skills and his mana territory was proving as useful as he expected it to be. It was a series of metal rings, each connected by a series of thin chains. It was entirely black, the metal lacking any rust or blemishes. He didn't even find any scratches along the metal. There were 7 rings in total, each was designed to fit around a limb, and the chains would connect them across a creature's body. It was designed to work with creatures that weren't humanoid and had extra rings to place around addition places. It was a matter of coverage, not of finding a separate limb for each ring. Explaining how to wear it, he told Jill of its function. A magical armor of a high quality, it grew in strength with the more mana a person had. Any of them could use the item, but Luke's size changes might damage the item, and Red and Mash already had armor. Jill's armor was of a simple leather variety, and the upgrade would be big. From what Priscilla had sent him, he knew that it would form into an armor of ice and was as flexible as his own creations. None of the others bother arguing, knowing that they had no reason for the item. Red made a wall of blood, Jill moving behind it to change into the armor. It didn't take her long, and she came out wearing the armor beneath her clothes. Well, the chains ran beneath her clothes, the actual rings were too large and hung on her ankles, wrists, and neck. She had an extra ring around each ankle, and it reminded Mash of prison shackles. Deciding it was better not to say that out loud, he watched in amazement as Jill poured her mana into the armor. Immediately, the shackles tightened, fitting tightly to her limbs. The one on her neck grew a little thinner, resembling a more traditional necklace. Soon the other parts did too, becoming more like accessories than shackles. It was the next thing that really surprised him. She didn't get an armor of ice, instead the space around her warped. It seemed to blur, to distort like it would when she used her spells. It blurred her body, and he didn't know if it would function as armor. With his mana territory he could tell what was happening, the armor took the aspect of whatever mana fed into the object. As a test he threw a small piece of wood at her. Rather than being stopped completely, it bent and slowed, moving out of the way. "Try a sword." Excited, she prompted Mash to try something else. He didn't refuse, equally intrigued by the strange armor. Forming a staff out of wood, he swung it lightly at her. He wasn't trying to hit her, instead testing to see how it would respond to a swung weapon. Bending unusually as it entered the armor, he was unable to feel any strain on the wood and continued his swing. It took longer than he expected for the weapon to reach her, and when he did make contact the force had been dispersed thoroughly. He would need to strike a lot faster if he wanted to do real damage to her. Priscilla showed him an image of what she did against the ice armor. She used her enormous size to crush the man, ignoring the armor's presence in its entirety. The more scenes he got from Priscilla, the happier he was that she only had a few bodies at the time of their fight, and the more excited he was to see her power when she had access to more bodies. Jill deactivated the armor, excitedly moving towards the others, where Luke and Red were looking at the 4 remaining items. Mash's eyes lingered on her for a second, the new jewelry looked nice on her, but he kept the compliment to himself. He felt like Priscilla was going to say something, but he stopped her, asking about the remaining items. She must have realized his intentions, moving her focus to the remaining items. The next item would go to Luke. It was another storage device. Previously, Mash thought that the items were supposed to be rare, but now every member of their group would have one. The designs were overtly feminine, the engravings resembling fine jewelry, each was a light shade of pink. It's a storage space for Luke. He tossed the item to him, but Jill snatched it out of the air. She took off her own bracelet, removing the items from it, before handing that one to Luke. He didn't seem to argue, glad to receive one that wasn't so feminine. Looking at the flower tattoo around his forearm, Mash muttered something under his breath. He hoped Luke would end up being forced to use the feminine accessory, forgetting that his condition with attuned items was special. Well, it didn't matter much, both items were relatively the same size, while his seemed to be growing. It seemed like the unusual method of his attunement was causing his item to grow as he got stronger, approaching the size of Red's storage space. Moving on to the next item, he stared at it uncertainly. It was a complex picture, a painting of something he did not know. It even took Priscilla a while to figure out what the item did, but then he felt her use some of her mana on a skill. What was that? He asked the question while observing how the mana was moving within Priscilla's body. He normally wouldn't be able to do this, but his connection with her allowed him to peer into her mana. A simple way to identify magic. Even the most basic creatures should be able to do this. She sounded condescending in her response, but she showed him how he could do it as well. Before getting the information on the item, he attempted to replicate what she was doing. He began the process, but it fell apart quickly. However, Priscilla managed to guide his energy, and direct him to complete the spell. He got a feeling for what the item did, only slightly better than what he could tell with his mana territory. It was a flight item, though he didn't have the vaguest idea of how to use it. Asking Priscilla for the details, she just sent him an image of himself shrugging his shoulders. It was an odd gesture, though it did get the message across. He informed the others as well, and only Red had seen a similar item before. A flight item was useful, for everyone but Mash, so they got into a small debate about who should have it. Ultimately, they decided that Luke should get the item. Mash and Jill had ways to escape from fights, and Red had a high degree of survivability with her skills. Luke was also their primary healer, and giving him the ability to move about the battlefield quickly was valuable. Red explained how it was used, and Luke began using it. To use the item, Luke needed to lay the painting out across his back, then attune to it. It would melt into his skin but should still be removable if he ever lost the need for it. Immediately, Mash tried unattuning to one of his items, but found that he couldn't. He expected as much but was still a little disappointed. His necklace was fairly obsolete now, Priscilla's boosts to his healing being more significant than the item, plus she could immediately close flesh wounds by expending some of her own flesh. When Luke was finished with the item, he was left with a strange-looking tattoo. Upon testing the item, he grew wings of pinkish light from his back. They were unlike anything he had ever seen, shaped into almost perfect triangles. They didn't beat or sway, he simply rose from the ground, the wings unmoving on his back. He wasn't all that impressed and was more excited by the remaining two items. One was a mask of some kind, it covered everything but a person's eyes. Similar in shape to a human's mask but had a long slit around the jaw. It seemed to open with a person's mouth, but a human couldn't possibly open it to its full size. The mask was entirely white, unblemished despite its years of unuse. It was magical in nature, but neither he nor Priscilla understood what it did. It had some type of magic on it, but it was not something either of them had experienced before. Their identify skill also yielded no results. Rather than risking using something that might be cursed, he placed into his storage space. They kept most of their valuables in his space, after they realized that no one would be able to tell that he had one. It also seemed like stealing it was out of the question. The final item was similarly beyond them, and he placed it into his space after a quick examination. It looked like the bone of some creature, though he did not know what. It was thin and long. At first, he thought it was a tooth, but noticed a hole that followed along the inside. The bone itself was as big as his palm, and he wondered what creature this piece originally belonged to. With the items out of the way, they made their way to the exit. It was a short trip, and he made sure to check every wall as they passed. The trip that should have only taken an hour or two, took almost 5 with how thorough he was being. By the time they got to the exit, they were eager to get out of the dungeon. They had learned of the time alterations ahead of time and knew that almost 8 days had passed. Mash had learned from his friends that they had been in the dungeon for almost 2 days. He never realized, only now considering how long he was unconscious while in the dungeon. Thinking about how many times he passed out, he was amazed to realize how many close calls he experienced. This dungeon almost killed him several times over, though one of those was Leah, and another 2 times were Priscilla. Priscilla apologized as he stepped through the exit gate of the dungeon. He dismissed the apology quickly, instead locking eyes with the group of people waiting for them. Standing there was Ellis, her mana suffocating the air around them. Chapter 47, Unknown Outcomes. Ellis was able to restrain them with her mana alone, it spread around the room like a spider's web. He was stuck in place, frozen by an instinctual fear. At first he thought it was his inhumanity skill, but since the others were in the same position, he figured it was some skill. Priscilla seemed to be immune, and he could feel her preparing to do something. Stopping her with a thought, he opened his mouth to speak, but was forestalled by a gesture from Ellis. "We will talk elsewhere, for now just follow me." Her tone was cold, but he didn't hear any sadness in her voice. Hopefully that meant that Leah wasn't her real sister, or that their relationship was bad. The looks she gave him told him otherwise, but she had plenty of other reasons to glare at him. However, he was unable to resist, any fight would only lead to his death. The things he heard about his future implied that he wouldn't die here, but perhaps his second mark had twisted his fate further. Priscilla didn't have any knowledge that could help in this situation either. Expecting Ellis to lead them out of the guild, he was surprised when she took them to a smaller room near the dungeon entrance. After his group entered the room, Ellis followed while her retinue of guards remained outside. As soon as the door closed behind her, she spoke openly, knowing that her words couldn't be heard outside. "I take it Leah didn't make it out of the dungeon. Though, I would like to know what exactly happened to her. She was killed in the fight with the boss, the bandits' attacks made it so that we couldn't save her." Red's response came out quickly, fast enough that it sounded as pre-rehearsed as it was. It turned out that she wasn't a very good liar. They thought it would be the best idea to let her speak since she was the most diplomatic of the group, but that didn't seem to make her any better at lying. Despite how she sounded, it's not untrue. Leah really did die during the boss fight. Although, none of us would have helped her, even if we could. She used a charm skill on Luke and was controlling him. Jill's performance was a lot better than Red, able to sound genuinely angry. She had sounded accusatory during the last portion of her statement, doing a great job at playing up her anger. He wasn't surprised though, they were all still angry and hurt, the betrayal having caught them off guard. Not to mention, the vile magic she used on Luke. Ellis still looked at them with amusement more than anything else. "I know what happened prior to the fight with the boss." Ellis's voice was condescending, though it was clear that she wasn't lying. After thinking about it he realized that there was another bandit, whom they hadn't seen at the final fight. It only made sense, Leah would obviously have a way to communicate with Ellis, especially if they were sisters. If she knew so much information, what was the point of this charade? They were so far beneath her in terms of strength, that he didn't really know what she wanted. None of them had a response to her statement, remaining silent and waiting for her to continue. "I don't care much for Leah, it is more important for me to receive the items she was carrying." She was glaring at them, her mana seeming to lean on them imposingly. They did find the suspected items, having stored them within Mash's storage space. His device was hidden completely and couldn't be taken from him. His unusual attunement method was proving itself rather useful now. He had thought of this situation being a possibility and knew that he needed to maintain his leverage. Ellis moved over to Jill and Red, asking them to open their storage spaces before them. He wondered why she didn't just take the items. As soon as they were opened, she moved on to Luke. She must have a method to know if the item was there. She got no new response from Luke, turning to Mash. She thought that he didn't have a storage item since no accessories were visible on him. She did a more normal check, using her mana to scour his body for any items. She didn't find it but must have sensed something from his presence. She raised an eyebrow, knowing that there was some trick here. "I'm guessing I can't force you to give me the item. Well, what are your demands?" She didn't sound cold anymore, instead seeming to enjoy the situation. Taking a seat at a table he hadn't noticed before, she prompted him to take the other chair. Whatever conclusions she arrived at seemed to be beneficial to them. There probably weren't many people that would do anything to inconvenience her. Narrowing her eyes, and smirking slightly as she approached Mash, he found his heartbeat rising. He was uncertain if it was fear or attraction, Ellis still being as beautiful as before. He took the seat reluctantly, only now realizing that he hadn't really gotten a good look at the room. It was small and seemed designed to make deals or trades. This was probably a place where adventurers made trades or signed agreements. It was mostly empty, a single table in the center of the room. The table and chairs were unremarkable, the only standout feature of the room being the enchantments he could see engraved into the wall. It was lit unnaturally, the engravings on the wall providing a small amount of illumination. All we want is to leave town safely. If that means giving you the items, then we will, but we want some assurances of some kind. He spoke confidently, despite knowing that his demands did not have to be met. She could easily kill them after getting the items, he just hoped that she wouldn't. Mash hated talking like this, the only reason she couldn't just kill them outright was the item in their possession. The guild could also cause some problems if they ever found out that Ellis had killed them. It was illegal, and sacrilegious to kill someone so far beneath one's level. Even with all these things in place, he knew that she might not care. After all, she was working with bandits. Fine, I can agree to those terms, with one condition of my own. You will agree to sign a contract to ensure your silence. Ellis sounded strangely relieved, after hearing his demands. Mash considered what the item might do. He never actually checked what it did, instead storing Leah's entire body within his space. They hoped that Ellis would be happier to know that they didn't take anything from her sister's corpse. It was meant to support their claims that she died unfortunately. He had managed to make it fit by dumping a few of the things in there. The fact that she offered a contract meant the item was incredibly valuable. A contract would bind the both of them to specific conditions, and even she shouldn't be able to break them easily. He glanced at the others, relief written clearly on their faces. He had no reason to refuse and nodded to her. I have Leah's body, and none of us have even touched it. The items she had are yours to take. Ellis nodded, moving to the door. Opening it slightly, she gave a quick command to one of the knights outside. Within a few minutes he returned with a contract. It was a powerful one, the mana actually visible around the parchment. Ellis wrote the conditions, and she slid it over to Mash. While he did read it over, he made sure that Red could also read the terms. She would be better able to read through loopholes within a contract like this. From what he could tell, the contract would ensure that they would be let out of the city safely. They couldn't return until after the end of the contract and wouldn't be able to talk about the situation here for the same duration. If they broke any of the conditions they would die. For Ellis's part she would let them leave safely and send no one to pursue them. Also, she would not do anything to actively seek their deaths for the duration of the contract. The contract only lasted half a year, but it would at least let them escape safely. If she broke the contract, she would only temporarily lose her abilities. The punishment was a lot lighter, but they were in no position to refuse the terms, not to mention that it would most likely mean that she wouldn't break it immediately. It's as good as we can expect. Red tried to sound disappointed, but she knew that it was a better deal than they expected to get. So, only with a small amount of hesitation, he signed the contract. It didn't feel all that magical as he signed it and he let the others sign it after he did. As soon as Ellis added her own signature, he felt the contract take hold. It was like something had wrapped around his heart, but Priscilla informed him that it affected the soul. He didn't really care about what it had literally done, instead using his meditation skill to ease the strain on his body. He wanted to maintain a calm exterior, even if she was aware of a skill being used. With the contract in place, he removed Leah's body from his storage space, watching Ellis for any reaction. If she cared at all, she didn't show it, calmly examining the body. It only took her a couple seconds, but she pulled out something from one of Leah's pockets. It was a small jewel, about the length of his finger. It shone vaguely red, but the colors seemed to shift the longer he stared at it. What is it? He asked the question. It wasn't like anything would change even if he knew. Priscilla only gave him a vague message that it was powerful, but she did not know what exactly it did. Ellis's face changed as she held the object, donning what looked like a genuine smile as she held the item up to her face. It seemed that her sister's life was far less important in comparison. It's a core for a golem. For the defender of the city, the greatest golem made by King Kenzan. She sounded proud, as if the creation had been her own. If the golem core was so valuable, he was glad to be leaving town before it was activated. He didn't need to ask any more details about the item, the reverence she was carrying for it spoke volumes. At the very least, it would be able to quell any opposition, or so she believed. He didn't doubt it either, the previous Beastman King had been the most capable builder in history. Some of his constructs still operated in the capital now. That king had been the one to spread how crafting classes could be powerful. People could get crafting-related classes, but in the past they believed them to be an inferior class. That changed when the Beastman King Kanzan rose to power. He had a pure crafting class, though no one knows which class exactly. His constructs were unbelievably powerful, and he was able to survive and win wars without expending any lives. With his rise, came the rise of others trying to emulate his abilities and creations. Even now, crafting classes were taken much more frequently. There were plenty of reliable methods to receiving crafting-related classes, and the kingdom would accept whoever took this path. The capital was full of these classes, and the rest of the towns usually ended up with second-hand products from there. When he visited the capital, he would be sure to find some interesting items. If this really was for a golem that he created, it could easily be stronger than someone at level 200. Not wanting to ask any more questions, he was a little afraid to interrupt Ellis again and waited for her to finish her revelry. They would soon be out of town, and nothing was more important than that. Now, he just hoped that nothing would get in their way. Ellis left the room, returning after a few tense minutes. Nobody wanted to say or do anything, remaining silent while they waited for her to return. Once she returned, she looked almost cheerful as she led them out of the room. "Well, I hoped you liked our city, but I think it's time you moved on." They nodded along, surprised by the sudden shift in Ellis's tone. She was as eager to be rid of them as they were to leave. No matter who won the battle, this city would be changed forever. The way beastmen are treated in general would probably shift, regardless of who won. Thinking about how the people in his hometown would react to the news, he realized that this war would only cause the other races to distrust beastmen. They already received poor treatment, and it would only get worse. He looked towards Luke, wanting to ask him about his family, but now was not the right time. They left the guild building and were led directly to an exit of the city. Jill having mentioned that they were heading further east. He just hoped that nothing else would go wrong. Chapter 48, Leaving. Mash found himself beneath a gateway, identical to the one he used to enter the town. The only difference being that it was on the east side. His attention was diverted from the gate itself, instead drawn to the knights beneath the archway. Davin was there, along with a small group of knights comparable in size to the group that followed Ellis. Unlike before, there was a tension in the air as they approached. He could see some of the glances passed between Ellis and Davin and knew that he didn't want to find himself in the middle of them. Hoping that he would be able to leave freely, he walked to the gate with the others. He was stopped by Davin, who called out to them as they tried to pass. "I see that you're leaving. Was the dungeon not what you expected?" Wanting to stay silent, Mash shook his head in the negative, but Jill still chose to respond. "Yeah, it didn't go well, and we want to try our luck elsewhere." He was finding out that Jill was a rather capable liar, using half-truths to avoid lying directly. It was said that the Fae would trick people with similar forms of deception. Was she always able to lie like this, or did she become more inclined to it after getting her new class? Ever since he found out that classes influenced the mind, he began to wonder what other changes might occur from a new class. He would ask Jill about it later. In fact, it was a discussion he wanted to have with everyone. Currently though, he focused on Davin and Ellis. "We could use your help. Each bandit you kill would get you a decent chunk of gold. So, how about it?" Davin's question didn't sound serious, rather it seemed like he was probing for information. Whether Mash was falling for a trick or not, he gave him a genuine response. The truth would work well in this situation. "We aren't suited for killing other people, learned that the hard way." There was not joke in his voice, his words as dry as they sounded. Davin got the point, his mouth forming into a thin line. Mash didn't care about being polite anymore, the only thing he wanted to do now was leave. He might not have understood the intricacies of the tension between Ellis and Dave, but he knew that Davin wanted them to remain. He didn't care why, it wasn't even an option anymore. With the contract signed, they just needed to leave and get out of the city's business. "Fine, but you won't be able to return soon." He made it sound like a threat, like some big loss, but Mash didn't really want to come back. Davin probably believed that being unable to return would bother Ellis. There wasn't much left for conversation, and their group left eagerly. He could feel the eyes tracing them as he left. Davin and Ellis were not the only ones watching them, he could feel the gazes of all the knights while they made their way into the clearing. Once far enough out, Mash wasted no time forming his wings and grabbing his friends. Luke could fly now, but he would struggle with the mana consumption. They needed to stop soon and discuss where they wanted to go, and the nearest available town would still be a few hours of flying. He took off into the sky, not bothering to say a word. Going higher and faster than he did before. He was a higher level now and had made improvements to his physical stats. Now he was able to fly much more quickly, and his friends were screaming as they took off. They weren't screaming out of fear, for their freedom. He didn't know when it had happened exactly, but that city had quickly become more of a cell than the dungeon he was in. He found himself smiling as he met the sky. The sun was descending, and the clouds were tinted slightly orange by the changing light. The forest that they flew over before stretched beneath them. They would soon reach the borders of the forest, but for now they were given the image of an ocean of leaves swaying in the wind. The golden light of the sun, making the leaves look as if they were changing colors. They just watched the sight in silence, awed until they made it to the edge. The forest gave way to a grassy plain, the grass having grown thick without the trees stealing their light. As they flew, he made sure to keep the ground within his sight to discern where they were headed. Knowing that the next city would be along the road, he made sure to always keep it within his sight. Looking over the new terrain, he was a little surprised to see peaceful creatures. With the forest having been filled with monsters, he somewhat expected the surrounding territory to have its own set of monsters. He recognized the animals though, having seen them on occasion back home. They were called geth, identified by a singular long tusk jutting from the side of their mouths. Each creature was long and had 6 pairs of stubby legs. They were covered in a reddish-brown fur, each creature was nearly as long as Priscilla was at full size. Most considered the creatures to be cute, with large open eyes that glittered under the remaining sunlight. A short snout, that was rounded near the end made them look relatively harmless. They were often brought for celebrations, their docile nature making them perfect for riding. Nobles would pay a fortune for one, but everyone knew not to hunt them near adults. Despite their look and nature, each adult was as strong as high-leveled warrior. He looked and saw that many more of the creatures traversing the plains, it seemed like the herd was moving southwards. He might have followed them if he were on his own, or if the group wasn't desperate for good rest. That was the only decision that they were able to agree on. None of them were in the mood to enter another dungeon immediately and decided to take 1 or 2 weeks of rest. Mash thought it was too much time, but his friends wouldn't even entertain an argument. He guessed that it was a good idea and would ask them if they wanted to go to the capital. If he was going to rest for a while, he wanted to visit his siblings. Both lived in the capital, and he had plenty of interesting stories for them to hear. It was a little bit sooner than he expected, and he realized just how much time had really passed. It had only been around a month since he left his hometown, and so much happened in that short period of time. From clearing 2 dungeons, to encountering godly beings, he received information that was likely forbidden. That was not even mentioning the drastic changes to his body and soul. Would they even recognize him? Could they? He was so different now that he didn't even know if it would be possible. The thought made him a little anxious, and the edges of his lips drew downwards. He was becoming a monster, and he was slowly coming to terms with that reality, even finding himself embracing it. Maybe he would get an illusion item at the next city though, just to be safe. Thinking about it, he asked Priscilla about why he seemed so averse to picking up the item. Even now, just thinking about using an illusion item was making his skin crawl, it was as if he was reacting to something dangerous. It is harmful. Your unusual nature with attuned items would make the item limit your physical abilities. Priscilla sounded a little like she was chastising a child. He imagined what his own thoughts must seem like to her. In her eyes, he was a young monster who was strangely trying to hide his own skin. Not once having considered that attuning to items could be harmful to him, he considered the 2 items he was already attuned to. Were either of them harmful? And what did it mean that attuning to an illusion item would make him weaker? He also guessed that it was his inhumanity skill that warned him of the dangers of attuning to one of those items. The skill was useful in a lot of ways, and it seemed it would warn him about doing anything to harm himself. What else did the skill do? It was a vague at best, and it seemed to accomplish a diverse set of tasks. He couldn't really narrow down how it worked but figured that Priscilla might be able to. Just thinking about her seemed to give her the green light to enlighten him, making it seem like she was waiting for him to ask her. Realizing that was the case, he remembered that he could just as easily peer into her mind. This time she didn't speak her response, instead reacting to the fact that he was looking into her mind. She thought of the information as he looked, letting him learn what he needed to more quickly. All monsters, perhaps all non-human creatures, had some method of detecting danger. Some way to avoid things that would otherwise hamper them. In the process of becoming more monster-like, Mash was growing this ability with his inhumanity skill. The skill was essentially developing his inhuman senses and creating those which he did not normally possess. A few that he was still lacking was the sense of hunter. He should be able to tell what creatures were far beneath him, and which to avoid. His previous methods using Mana territory ended up being wrong, and he was glad to know that he would eventually get another way to gauge someone's strength. He had been so distracted with his own thoughts, that he was surprised to see the town pop up into sight. It was close enough now, that he should have been able to spot it earlier. It was not as large or fancy as the other cities he was at, but it did have a series of stone walls. The walls weren't as high as he was used to and were made of interlocking stones. At first, he thought it was likely to topple over, but he could make out people walking on top of it, certain that it would hold them aloft. Not wanting to scare the town by landing before their walls, he went out to a nearby patch of trees. It wasn't a forest, but it would cover him as he landed and deposited his wings. Upon landing he felt the waves of unconsciousness hit him, and almost resisted them but still fell to the ground. He was woken up shortly after getting a boost to his energy recovery from Luke's healing. They were ready to go, the sun was now gone from the sky, and night was settling into its place. They headed towards the town, glad to have a secure place to rest for the night. They approached the front of the town. The doors were closed now, but there were guards standing on the outside to let people in. He thought about making himself a simple mask, as it would hide most of his unusual features. He decided against it, thinking that it would only make him seem more suspicious. He wasn't the one to approach the guards. Red was still the best among their group to speak to strangers. "Hello, what brings you lot to our town? Not many young people come this way." The guard was old, and rounder than Mash would expect from a long-time fighter. He didn't wear a full set of armor, instead just having a single metal plate strapped to his chest. Leaning against a spear he had stuck into the ground, he was standing casually. He was smiling at them, seeming as amiable as possible, and he had the look of a friendly grandfather. The kind of person who everyone liked. He didn't look to be in the best shape for a guard. However, his non-reaction to their unusual appearances spoke to his experience. The other guard with him was moving nervously, but seemed to be calming down from the other one's casualness. "Well, that was good, it seemed like there wouldn't be any fights. We are adventurers, just looking for a place to sleep for the night." Red spoke casually, although none of them were familiar with talking to guards. She held out her adventurer badge, and everyone else made theirs visible as well. They usually let her speak because she looked the most human and had an air of nobility. She never revealed that she was a noble, but most commoners seemed to be able to tell easily enough. The guards were no different, and Mash saw the younger one standing a little straighter once she spoke. "Of course, adventurers are always welcome. I do recommend staying at the Everlasting Sun, it should suit all of your tastes. Welcome to Forest's Edge." The older man sounded confident in his recommendation, pushing open the gate behind him as he spoke. The gates were a lot smaller than Crawl, but opening them so casually was still a demonstration of strength. Mash only paid a little attention to the feet, his attention being drawn to the city before him. He stepped back reflexively, alarmed by what he saw before him. The town was not what he expected. Chapter 49, Masks. The town was unusual for many reasons, the biggest of which was the plethora of people still roaming the streets despite the late time of day. Each person he saw wore accessories that glowed brightly against the night, illuminating their appearances. The other thing he noticed was the diversity of the crowd, many people of differing races being easily identified. Not to mention the inhuman changes appearing on some people, from odd eyes to patches of altered skin. He noticed the telltale marks of adventurers. Looking over the crowd, he asked the guard a question. "Is there a festival or something going on?" This sight could only be because of some grand event, but the old man just laughed at his bewilderment. His response came out in a knowing tone that one might misconstrue as smug. "No lad, this is just how the town is at night. Plenty of adventurers retire here, and we offer them the freedom they want. Again, welcome to Forest's Edge, a hidden paradise for adventurers." Mash was more than a little excited to explore the town now. It had looked unremarkable from the outside, probably using illusion magic to hide the lights and buildings. It was practically unheard of to use illusion magic to cover an entire town, but they seemed to be managing it somehow. Not to mention with all the retired adventurers here, they were sure to have diverse skill sets. He wouldn't be surprised to hear that this town was, in fact, one of the more powerful settlements. Just looking over the crowd before him, he guessed that it was stronger than his home city, despite being under half the size. As they entered the crowd, Mash remembered to ask for the guard's name. He received it while the guard waved at him, telling them to enjoy themselves. Apparently, people referred to him as Gus, and that they should use his name when they got to the inn. While going to the inn was a good idea, they did not go quickly, walking through the crowds of adventurers. It was dense enough that running would prove difficult on the narrow streets. Their slow pace did allow for a good look of the town. The name of the town seemed ever more inappropriate the further in they went. It was accurate for the location of the town but did nothing to convey its true nature. The buildings were tall, and closely bunched together. Lights bleeding through almost every window he could see. Each building made of a different colored stone, the combination making the streets shift like rainbows. The streets were narrow, only wide enough to fit 2 carts. They were crowded by large groups of people who shuffled slowly through the streets. The smells of foods and drinks coming off strongly from every person that passed by. All of them wore some type of glowing accessory, illuminating them in the night. In most towns, people would hide their monstrous transformations, but here it seemed like they were embracing it, showing it off as a badge of glory. They watched the many stores as they passed, having wanted to get some accessories of their own. Although they realized that it wasn't entirely necessary. Mash's eye already shone faintly in the night. Still, he wanted to get some, if for nothing else than to fit in with the town. They also wanted a good meal and were looking for a place to sit and eat. That didn't stop Mash from grabbing a bite to eat at every vendor they passed. Most sold simple skewers, but he found 2 that sold some kind fruit. It was coated in a sweet syrup, but the fruit itself was strangely sour. The combination had been excellent, and he found himself getting those at every opportunity. They found a jewelry store first, and were ushered in by Red, who seemed oddly excited to be going inside. Jill did not partake in her enthusiasm, originally saying that it would be needlessly expensive and unnecessary. Red managed to convince her, after stressing the amount of gold they had on them. Between their group they had a small fortune and could even afford some of the most expensive jewelry in the shop. He didn't really have any expectations as he entered the store but was still impressed by the layout. Along one half of the room, were a series of bookshelves. Each shelf lined with different types of crystals. The other half had different types of metals laying in piles across the room, different shapes and cuts easily discernible among the piles. The floors and walls were made of some white stone that was flecked with specks of different colors. At one corner of the room, next to the entrance, there was a table set up. There wasn't anyone there currently, and he didn't really know what to do and followed the others. They didn't get very far, stopping as a lady approached from some back room. She moved quickly, faster than he could accomplish, appearing only a few feet in front of them. Her jewelry, of which she had plenty, jingled as she moved. What looked like 10 different necklaces and bracelets clanging against one another, as she made a small bow in greeting. It was directed at Red, and she spoke with a measured degree of deference. "Greetings, my lady, welcome to my humble shop. What can I do for you today?" Her bow grew deeper as she spoke, and Mash looked away feeling slightly uncomfortable. The gesture automatic, feeling like it would be impolite to do anything else. She wore a dress that revealed a lot of her skin. Also being made of silk and having pieces of jewelry weighing down the edges made it hang loosely, and that was while she was standing straight. Focusing on the nearby gemstones, he heard Red introduce them. "Hello, and there is no need for formalities. I am here as an adventurer. My friends and I, only looking to acquire some of the accessories we have seen on others." Despite her words, she sounded noble, having fallen into her old habits quickly. The shopkeeper seemed to take it in stride, quickly changing her posture and tone, as if everything thus far had just been an act. "Well then, I will wait for you by the table. I'm assuming you know how things are done here." Her tone really did sound completely different, and her appearance seemed less regal as well. Nothing changed of her clothing or jewelry, but she wasn't standing as straight nor with the same level of forwardness. After she left, Red led them over to the gemstones, telling them of how to purchase jewelry. Mash and Luke listened attentively, but Jill had already left to check out the items. She must have known what to do, her background as a merchant's daughter having given her the knowledge. The shop functioned simply: a person would pick out their favorite gemstones, then choose an accompanying metal. From there they could either request a specific design for the piece or let the shop owner make it. She would have some general designs that could be made quickly. Mash looked over the gemstones but wasn't thinking about which was his favorite. Rather he was imagining what he wanted for the completed piece. Not to mention it would be a good opportunity to get his siblings some presents. He was going to visit them soon, and these seemed perfect. It took him a while to come up with things, but even once he was still faster than the others. Jill seemed to be paying more attention to the price of each item, but he thought that was unnecessary. From what he had seen, the amount of gold that he had would be enough for everyone to buy several pieces of jewelry. It was only in moments like this, did he realize just how much money they earned from their first dungeon run. They still had 2 more items to identify too, selling just one of them would probably be enough to afford all the jewelry they wanted. Red was meticulously amassing a pile of gemstones, and Luke was perusing the metals. Now that Mash knew what he wanted, he grabbed a few clear gemstones, ones that he could still gaze through if he tried. He knew glass would work for what he had in mind, but he thought that crystals would look nicer. For the other piece, he grabbed mostly black gemstones, knowing that other colors clashed with his usual appearance. He grabbed several large ones too, the color not being very popular. For his sister he grabbed a blue gemstone that resembled the sky, and his brother received one that reminded him of the blazing sun. Even without the enchantments to make it glow, it already seemed to shine faintly. Both gems were much more expensive than the ones he got. With the gemstones picked out he made his way to the front table, ready to make his purchases. When he arrived with a veritable handful of gems, the lady's expression changed drastically. The number of gemstones he picked up had told her of his wealth. And she must have guessed that he was also some rich aristocrat. It seems you have found things to your liking, do you have anything in mind for their shape and glow? Sounding strangely intrigued, she moved in a way to accentuate her beauty. It was entirely unnecessary, having seen her charm earlier. That did not mean that it wasn't working, his heart was certainly beating faster than it was before. He coughed a little before speaking, finding a need to clear his throat. Can you turn the black gems into small triangle shapes, and one of the clear ones into a larger triangle? The other clear one should be a circle, but the same size. Oh, and make them flat, like a piece of glass might be. Also, can you make the black gems glow, but leave the clear ones as is? He made some awkward gestures with his hands, to indicate the size of each object. She seemed a little confused at first but obliged nonetheless. After those were done, he handed her the 2 bigger gemstones he grabbed for his siblings, having them made into spheres. He asked for the blue one to glow white, that way it would resemble the sky, and the yellow glow orange so that it would shine like fire. He was surprised to see her perform all the magic herself, from changing the shapes of the stone to adding light to them, she alone was enough to do it all. How many different types of magic did she have access to? With the variety she demonstrated, he guessed she must have been a high level. It didn't even take her long to complete the process, even with him changing the lengths of some of the gemstones. This is going to cost you 74 gold pieces, and I want to see what you have in mind for them. He paid, not wanting or willing to haggle. He was not talented at it, and she already had the advantage. He nodded to her, handing her the money, and grabbing the black gems first. After which he began growing his wood out in the shape of half a mask. It covered the lower half of his face, the black gemstones made to look like the teeth of a beast. With the patches of black scales on his wood, the teeth seemed even more at home. He put it on in a mock gesture, and the shopkeeper already had a mirror held out for him to use. She gave him an approving whistle as he used the mirror to see the result. With his abnormal eyes, the half mask seemed to fit almost too accurately. The crystal's glow was enough to illuminate the rest of his face and neck, highlighting the deformities in a dark light. Now, others would certainly believe he was a monster. He tested it, opening and closing the mouth as he wanted. It was perfect, though not something he would wear during the daytime or in front of normal people. It would be perfect for tonight and would also do wonders to scare people in a fight. Though, he didn't really need help with that. The next piece he worked on was the 2 clear crystals. They lacked any glow but were easy to see through. This is what he would use to hide his monstrous features when needed. Since illusion items didn't work, he wanted to have a mask at the very least. He now knew that he couldn't keep going about as he had, the others would be too inconvenienced by his appearance. This became a half mask too, but instead covered the top half of his face. Big enough to hide the scales around his eyes and the eyes themselves. Each of the clear crystals became eye sockets, the triangle matching with his snake-like eye, and the circular crystal matching his new eye. With both in place he donned the mask, using the mirror again to check its appearance. It had oddly been covered almost entirely in scales. Normally his wood only had the occasional patch of scales, but this was entirely made of them. Though it was a little unusual and would make him seem suspicious, it was still a lot better than his normal appearance. The mask looked even better than he imagined it would and could be combined to the lower portion if he ever wanted to do that. With that out of the way, he waited for the others to finish their own purchases. Chapter 50, Rest and Relaxation. Leaving the store, they were quite pleased with the accessories that they purchased. Jill chafed slightly at the amount of gold each of them had spent. He and Red ended up spending the most, with him using 74 gold to her 100 gold. Although, once he explained that the most expensive gems were for his siblings' presents, she relaxed significantly. Showcasing the items they got, they started making silly poses with them. It degraded into acting as though they were noble, which just caused Red to grow embarrassed. Mash felt a little bad, but he wasn't used to being with nobles, having spent years joking about them with his sister. They always seemed to need such peculiar treatment when they visited his mother's clinic. Red's jewelry was probably the best jewelry among the group, although her only competitor was Luke, who purchased a single set of earrings. Mash had never seen Beastman earrings, they were wide loops, and he had small blue crystals placed along the ring. It was a relatively simple design, especially when compared to Red's complex necklace. It wasn't unappealing though, the thin design of the metal making it seem fitting. The crystals were small spheres that were connected by a series of thin metal threads, each metal specifically chosen as to not be sharp. She even had a specific design in mind for it to be easily removable. Did she plan to wear it while fighting? That seemed foolish, and he hoped it was just a precaution. On the other hand, Mash and Jill didn't really buy proper jewelry, instead making some rather unique pieces. Mash had his two half masks, both of which were well received by his friends. The mouthpiece was perfect for highlighting the changes to his eyes and would work well for whatever they had planned for the rest of the night. They joked about how scary it looked when he made it open and close along with his own mouth. Finally hiding his inhuman features with the other mask earned a much more genuine applause. The clear crystals would reflect the small light that emanated from his eyes, essentially hiding them with their own light. He could still see too, the shop owner having used magic to let him see through it despite the reflecting light. She said it wasn't magic, only having changed the shape of the crystal internally. He didn't understand but was happy with the result. Jill got 3 small crystals, which were surrounded by a thin layer of barely visible metal. Having them shaped into raindrops, she wore one on her forehead. They all shone faintly gold, reflecting the color of her hair. She placed the final 2 underneath her right eye, drawing attention to the changes there. The armor essentially occupied every other place that jewelry might go, and the special metal it was made of would clash with most other colors. After she finished with her purchases, they left the shop looking for a meal in the inn. The night went by quickly after that, a rush of meeting people who commented on their accessories. He too gave his fair share of compliments, finding that it helped them better fit into the crowd. They didn't find a standalone restaurant but managed to get to the inn. It wasn't hard to find, every wall of the building having pictures of enormous glowing suns etched into them. They shone brightly enough to illuminate the surrounding streets, and there were inviting smells leaking through the entrance. It didn't take much convincing and they entered the inn, finding a tavern on the lowest floor. It was sectioned off by wealth, lines easily discernible among the floor and walls. Although, nobody seemed to care right now, people happily chatting with those across the divides. They were expecting to be unable to find a seat, but several tables had enough empty seats for them. It wasn't that the place was empty, rather that the round tables had almost 10 seats at each table. Most were occupied by a group of adventurers, and they didn't take up the whole table. Several tables were full, and he guessed that you would just find a seat at any available table. Before grabbing a seat, they made their way to the bar, to speak to the barkeep. He was a tall lanky man, an elf by the shape of his ears and his unusual height. Having never spoken to an elf, Mash was eager to approach him despite the imposing presence he gave off. Whatever his abilities or level was, the entire building was covered in his mana. He had long green hair, and brown skin that was covered in intricate tattoos. Different symbols patterned across his arms and neck. He wore a robe that hung over his shoulders and covered his entire body, but oddly enough his arms were fully exposed as though the sleeves had been cut off. "Hello, my name is Mash, and these are Red, Jill, and Luke. We were hoping you would have some rooms for tonight." Mash spoke first, eager to get to know the elf. He still wanted to visit that forest town he had seen in the painting. "Greetings children, I am known as Ivarin. I do indeed have some rooms that I can offer, though every available room only has 2 beds in them. 2 rooms for the night will be 1 gold piece, and may I say, that is a rather nice mask. It fits you perfectly." Mash was surprisingly happy to hear the compliment. The elf sounded vaguely regal, even giving a casual bow at his introduction. Honestly, Ivarin seemed like some untold prince, with his natural poise and tone. His words carried easily despite the noise the crowd behind was making. They paid for the rooms. It was a little expensive, but not so much so that it was unreasonable. After seeing how crowded the city had been, they expected it to cost more. They paid for 2 nights, deciding that they might want to explore the town more. Mash ordered an excessive amount of food, but the barkeep didn't seem at all fazed by the amount. Many of the other adventurers didn't seem bothered either. Maybe, skills that changed a person's hunger level was more common among those who experienced transformations. After ordering his food he looked over the tables, seeking out a good place to sit. Most of the tables were filled by adventurers, and some even seemed to be around his age. Those were the tables he absolutely did not want to sit at, though the others didn't seem to share his opinion. They chose a table near one of the walls. 4 of the seats were filled by people that looked to be around their age. Mash reluctantly followed them but scoured the tables for any better seats. On their way, he noticed another table that interested him more. The table was slightly tucked behind a wall, but the colors along the floors and wall meant that it was not meant for nobles. There were only 2 people sitting at the table, both were of races that Mash had never seen before. He had heard of them, but both races were comprised of relatively isolated communities. One was a squat man and was a head shorter than Mash himself. Despite his stature, his muscles were thick, and he had a lot of facial hair. It was tied into a braid, much like the hair on his head was. Each braid was bigger than Mash's palm. He was a dwarf, but Mash thought that dwarves couldn't leave their cities. The other person at the table was even more of a standout. At first, he thought that the person had been drastically changed by his class, but he managed to remember reading about a race that fit this description. A race of people who spent most of their lives living within ocean cities, away from any influence of other kingdoms. The man had violet scales covering his entire body, and his face reminded Mash of a dragon. His build was surprisingly sleek, not quite what Mash had expected from his readings. It was a lizardman, a race that was so rare on land that most people just assumed that they were monsters. With his new knowledge of what dungeons were, he wondered if many of the races in their kingdom were visitors from another world. It would make sense as to why each race seemed so drastically different. The lizardman was most likely the reason for the emptiness of the table. Also, as to why it was in a relatively hidden location. It didn't bother Mash, if anything the obscurity of the location made him want to sit there even more. So, he spoke up as they were going to go by. He only spoke for himself, not wanting to stop the others from talking to whomever they wanted to. "Can I sit here?" He didn't really know of a better way to ask for a seat. Expecting them to be hesitant, he thought that he would be rejected. The dwarf's response came out merrily, sounding surprisingly pleased to have someone take a seat. You can take a seat. Can't be worse company than this." His words were a little strange, and he always seemed to make sure the last word of his sentence was said the loudest. The dwarf gave off an exaggerated gesture of disgust as he spoke, but the lizardman ignored him and shrugged in acceptance towards Mash. Happily taking the seat, he wondered if his friends would do the same. Even if their party wasn't all human, both of these races were not often well received. Their isolation leading to a lot of bad rumors and stories about their kind. There were 9 seats at the table, and sitting down, he noticed that there was an extra glass next to the dwarf. Looked like they had at least one more companion. "Hi, I'm Mash. Got any interesting stories worth telling?" Introducing himself, he took a seat beside the lizardman. He was only a little surprised when the others took the seats beside him. He ended up becoming the divider between the 2 groups. Not minding his role, he was happy to hear the others introduce themselves. After which, the lizardmen took the opportunity to introduce themselves. "I am Zisha, and this is Hengel. While it is indeed true that I have interesting stories to tell, do you have any that we would like to hear?" 2 things surprised Mash about the lizardmen's words. First, their tone was feminine, strangely like Priscilla's projected voice, which meant that he was wrong to assume that they were male. The other thing was the clearness in their voice, even Mash's own voice was more inhuman. His changes weren't very drastic, his body having adjusted to the wooden portion of his neck. Though he could notice the faint echo that seemed to trail his words now. However, her actual words only made him grin. One of the things he was certain he had, was interesting stories. He was not so disillusioned, that he couldn't realize how many impossible encounters he has had over the past few months. He started to tell them of the dungeon they were just in, but was interrupted by a cough from Red. She made a little gesture with her hand, moving it as though she were signing something. Her concern was unnecessary, he was not foolish enough to break the contract. He knew that he could talk about most of their dungeon experience without breaking its terms and gave her a small nod in acknowledgement. So, he continued telling them of the dungeon experience, minus the encounter with the bandits. At first, they seemed disinterested, but that changed once he mentioned the world carrier. They looked skeptical at first but got reassurances from everyone else in his group. He made a show of his eyes, explaining that one was an imitation of the beings. The other was of another similar being. Before he could start explaining that story, the food arrived and took up his attention. The food had come out, the barkeep himself having brought it to their table, before he took a seat beside the dwarf. That was their missing companion. Mash wanted to continue his story but couldn't resist the temptation of food at his table. He started to eat. There was a surprising variety to the food that they brought out. His favorite was some western dish that was oddly spicy. It was served over a puffed grain, and he enjoyed its fluffiness more than the typical bread he was used to. Their guests didn't seem pleased at him not finishing his story, nor of him not elaborating on the other great being that they met. Jill picked up where he left off though, explaining their encounter with the string of fate, though she left out the visions that they had. They didn't appear as skeptical anymore, accepting their story now. He wondered why, and it turned out that they had seen the very same creature before. It seemed like the creature was often spotted, but most were not foolish enough to approach it. With that little bit of criticism given, the group went on to tell their own stories, and Mash eagerly devoured any information that they had to offer.